Alright, we're back here to talk about some Final Fantasy and some Dragon Quest. So a few weeks ago we did a video talking about Hironobu Sakaguchi, of course the creator of Final Fantasy, parting with Square Enix after like 20 some odd years of him leaving the company, because they're remastering his game Fantasian, this mobile game that I never heard of. The newer version I think is called Fantasian Neo Dimension, but within the interview that we looked at, he had expressed no interest in coming back to the franchise. Then much more recently, we did a video talking about Yuji Horii, the creator of Dragon Quest, discussing the silent protagonist in the modern gaming era. Anyways, very recently, within the last few days or so, I believe, they were on a radio show together talking about their respective franchises, and I thought it was kind of fitting that we'd done individual videos for them very, very recently on the channel, and that the fact that they were doing an interview together, I figured we'd talk about it. Now, it is a radio show they were on, so there's not video for this, obviously. We only have translations from Genki on Twitter. All the translations that I've seen on their timeline that they've done for this radio interview, I guess, is worth talking about, so let's hop into it. This one's a little interesting. Yuji Horii would sometimes tell Akira Toriyama this is not a protagonist character when he did main character designs for Dragon Quest. Horii wanted the protagonist characters to be kind of a blank slate to represent the player, so if Toriyama's main character design had too much personality in it, he would instead use the character as a sub-character. One example he mentioned is Terry from Dragon Quest VI. So with this, I completely understand what Yuji Horii is saying, and I don't even entirely disagree with what he's saying, but I do disagree. Because I personally like MMORPGs and really just games in general for my main character to have a pretty unique design, pretty cool design. I don't want them to be kind of under-designed to be sort of like a blank slate for me to, I guess, project myself onto, I guess. For one, that concept doesn't even make a ton of sense, at least with the Dragon Quest games that I played, which is very limited, to be fair. But Dragon Quest VIII, for example, the hero, they don't have their own name, so you can name them after yourself or whatever, I guess, or you can leave them as hero. But they do have a backstory, right? The hero in Dragon Quest VIII had a backstory with Castle Trodain and stuff like that. He was already an existing character before I even pick up the controller. Same thing with Dragon Quest XI and the hero, Luminary, the Cobblestone. There's already a history for this character before I'm ever playing the game. So the Dragon Quest protagonists aren't blank slates for me to project myself onto, right? They're not like an RPG where you craft your character from the ground up and their backstory. I am talking more story-related stuff as opposed to just the actual character designs themselves, but I don't think I really attach myself to any protagonist in any game based simply on their character design, right? I'm not looking at a character design well, that's, a little over-designed, so I can't even put myself in the character's shoes. I can't appreciate the character's point of view or something like that, right? It's kind of a weird take in my opinion. But also, as I mentioned, I do like my main characters in games to be, pretty well designed. I think Cheetahs from FF10 is a pretty good example of a character that's a little bit over-designed. I think there's a little too much going on at times with this character model, but I do think he looks pretty cool. And obviously, I think Cloud's very iconic. I think Squall looks cool. He's actually maybe my favorite designed Final Fantasy protagonist. I think he looks really, really cool with the fur jacket and stuff like that. Go back to the Dragon Quest series, Dragon Quest VIII, one of my favorite games of all time. Absolutely fucking love the game. I think the hero in that game isn't very cool looking. I think he's a very kind of bland looking character, and apparently that's intentional by Yuji Horii, but it's kind of to the detriment, I would say, because I wouldn't put the Dragon Quest VIII protagonist anywhere near the Final Fantasy protagonist. It would be so far down if we're talking about cool looking designs for a main character. But I'd say the same for Dragon Quest XI. I think that that character design's kind of bland and kind of boring. And for the majority of my playthrough, I actually use the Dragon Quest VIII outfit that's available in the game. I also find it kind of interesting too if you look at all the Dragon Quest protagonists side by side in this picture. A lot of them are pretty uniquely designed, right? They're not blank slate looking characters in my opinion. A handful of them are for sure, but I think at least half or more are pretty unique looking. So we spent a little more time in that section than I realized we would. Apparently I had a lot of thoughts and opinions. What are your thoughts though? In terms of your main character designs for your RPGs and I guess really games in general, do you like them to be more kind of toned down, more blank slate kind of characters, or do you want them to look more unique and more cool? Moving on to the next one. Dragon Quest creator Yuji Horii said he thought that Final Fantasy is a showing type of game, while Dragon Quest is a doing experience type of game. Sakaguchi said it always made him angry when he used to hear that. He said, it's not a show type of game, it's a video game, so you can't say that. You have to properly experience and play it. So I thought that was a kind of weird quote, just because I think they're very similar games in a lot of ways. Especially when you go to kind of a little bit earlier Final Fantasies and a little bit earlier Dragon Quest games. They're just turn-based RPGs, right? There's not a ton of difference between them. I think at a certain point, once you get to Final Fantasy VII, maybe even 6, and beyond, that's where they start to try to push the technology, the graphics of the games. That doesn't mean the stories are bad or the characters are bad or whatever, but there was a thing that kind of happened with the franchise at a certain point. But I assume because Sakaguchi says it used to make him mad when he'd hear that it was something they did in the past. And if we're talking the really early Dragon Quest and really early Final Fantasy games, they're quite similar game design wise, right? I mean, we're on the fucking Nintendo and the Famicom, right? There's not like a whole lot you could do. There's not like a whole lot of show you could do with those consoles for the most part. It was pretty much just play the games and experience them. He also adds, Horii said he wants Dragon Quest to be the type of game where you go, wow, this happened. I want to find out what's next. He said, recently games often have cutscenes that are too long. He just wants to get back to playing them and sometimes wants to skip the cutscenes. I also find that quote kind of funny because if you look at the most recent Dragon Quest, the Dragon Quest 11, you can look up like all the cutscenes on YouTube and there's a 21-hour video. Now that does include boss fights. I don't know how much that like adds to the video length, but even if you cut the video in half, you're still looking at like 10 or 11 hours of cutscenes, of just like dialogue, of just exposition. So that's a lot of like, showing and not experiencing. And while I did enjoy playing Dragon Quest 11, I mean, I took the time to platinum the game earlier this year, I felt that at times. There's some times where like, I feel like the dialogue was going on a little too long. I'm not saying that they were like overly long or anything, or like the exposition was overly long, but there was definitely times where I just wanted to like get on to like the journey, get back to like questing and wandering the world and shit. And I was just like, man, I care, but I don't care. Let's hurry up. As we get through the video here, I found myself disagreeing with the Dragon Quest creator quite a bit, which was never the plan. I mean, I knew we were going to talk about this shit, but I hadn't really thought about what I was going to say in response to a lot of the shit, but I seem to not necessarily agree with them. Finally, we have one for Sakaguchi here. Sakaguchi says, a problem for Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest is that there's too much expectation from players for them to continue without changing, and management gets pulled in that direction and do not take risks. He says there is no problem with them continuing as they are for players with nostalgia, etc., and that is good if they do continue as they are. But it is not good if they are unable to go in other directions, and says it's a problem if they are not able to use resources on new ideas or take risks. He says if it continues like that, people will grow tired of them as a result. So this is another one where I kind of have to agree and disagree. I agree because if you look at like the recent sales of Final Fantasy games, like they're not doing great. 7 Remake, it took a couple years, but as of like September or so of last year, it had hit like 7 million, I think. It took a few years to get there, but that's not bad. Final Fantasy 16, from what we've seen, didn't do very well, and Rebirth, did even worse. It did worse than like what Remake did, of course. So there is a bit of an argument to be made for the series kind of stagnating. Of course, there's a lot of like factors that can go into why something like the 7 Remake trilogy isn't like doing like crazy numbers, and even something like 16 to a certain degree we can argue. But where I got to disagree with Sakaguchi is I think more often than not the franchise has innovated. A lot of the series is the ATB system, turn-based or whatever, whatever term you want to use. But the games are quite different. 7 is pretty simple in its like game design, but you do have the materia system, which is very unique for the series and still is to this day. Final Fantasy 8 is obviously quite different from any game in the franchise. The junction system, the guardian forces, things like that to like really innovate in combat. Final Fantasy 9 is pretty simple too, kind of like 7, but you do have like the ability to like learn abilities from like weapons and armor and accessories, and you can only equip so many at a time, so it kind of promotes like unique builds and loadouts and things like that. 10 is kind of simple as well. It's very linear compared to the previous Final Fantasy games, but you do have the sphere grid, which is pretty cool for its time. By the end of the game, if you go through the effort of maxing everything, every character is pretty much the same, more or less. But you do have like the weapon and armor customization, which is pretty unique for the series. I don't really speak for like 11 and 14 too much, because I've only played 14, never played 11, but they're MMOs, so you kind of know what you're getting with those kinds of games. 12 is very simple, and it's kind of like 10 in a way. It's not as linear as 10, but you do have like the license board, which is more or less the sphere grid, especially in like the original version of the game. Made a bit better by the international version of the game, or the Zodiac Age version of Final Fantasy 12. There's also a crafting system in the game, but it's quite different from Final Fantasy 10, right? You don't just get to add abilities to weapons. You get pieces of crafting materials from either monsters, or you find them in the world, or rewards for questing or something like that. You sell at the bazaar, and it automatically crafts the item for you, which is pretty unique for the series. Also, it's how you get money. You don't just defeat a monster in the game and it drops like 500 gil or some shit, right? That just doesn't make sense. Why does that monster carry money? It's not realistic, right? You get pieces of it. It's almost like hunting. You go out there and you fight a bunch of monsters, get a bunch of pieces, and that's how you make money. Actually, speaking of hunting, there's hunts in the game, which, as far as I'm aware, was introduced in Final Fantasy 12, right? And that's something we've seen return through a lot of the games. Actually, pretty much every numbered Final Fantasy after it. 13 had some sort of hunts with like the Saith Stones. 14 has hunting in it. 15 has hunting in it, so does 16. The most standout thing from 12 would be the gambit system, of course, which is very polarizing in a lot of ways, but I absolutely love it. I'm not like super knowledgeable on it because I've only played through it one time, but it did have like the Crystarium, which is like a dumbed down version of the license board or the sphere grid. It also had the paradigm shifting with combat or whatever, so that's kind of cool, which is really just like the dress sphere shit, realistically, from Final Fantasy X too. Came to 15, there's obviously a lot of differences in that game compared to the rest of the franchise. It was like a true open world game for once for the series, which it wasn't handled very well, but it was still, a nice touch. That's why I bought the game, actually. You also had like the camping system with the experience and stuff like that, crafting food. You did have like an ability board. I can't remember what it's called. I always forget off the top of my head, but it's kind of similar to the sphere grid, license board, Crystarium, whatever. You can also fish in Final Fantasy 15, which puts it way up there for me. Like, that's a very fun minigame. If you add fishing as a side thing you can do in your RPG or your game in general, I'm sold. So 15 was like the first kind of like action RPG introduction to the series, right? And that's what we've seen kind of branch off into 7 Remake, 7 Rebirth, which are quite different in a lot of ways to the rest of the franchise, and even 16, which is very innovative, right? Kind of like Soulsborne-esque, very single-player focus. You do have teammates at times, but you're playing as Clive the whole time, right? You can't switch teammates or nothing. Which I guess technically 15 did that initially, but they did eventually add in the ability to switch over to the other characters. The point is, we just went through every single numbered entry besides the MMOs from 7 all the way to 16 and 7 Rebirth, and they're all quite different. And that's not even going through like the actual, all the different changes between the games, right? This is all top of the head. This is just what I can think of off the top of my head. So I don't know what Sakaguchi's talking about, because the series has always been very innovative. Like, yeah, there's like a reusing of stuff throughout the games. Like, there's a lot of the same summons, right? A lot of the same magic, things like that. Character names like Sid and, Biggs and Wedge pop up sometimes within the franchise. There was, the ATB system for a lot of the franchise. But still, if we just look at like what we talked about, from 7 all the way to like 16/7 Rebirth, even if they're all using like some form of like turn-based and or like ATB system, they're very different games. Again, I'm not sure what Sakaguchi's talking about, because I feel like they've been taking risks as long as I've been a fan of the franchise. Like, my knowledge goes from like Final Fantasy 7 all the way to like the modern era with the numbered entries. And I feel like every step of the way, every game I've played has been relatively innovative. They're not really that similar. I only focused on Final Fantasy for this section, but that's because my knowledge for Dragon Quest is very limited. I've only played 3 games in the series, 8, 9, and 11. So you guys can let me know if what Sakaguchi is saying here is true for the Dragon Quest series. Genki further adds, he is also talking about the issue of resources being focused on those series continuing instead of being used for new ideas or on other games. And this is another one where I'm going to have to kind of disagree, because I think Square Enix has been putting out new franchises, new IPs for quite a while now. In fact, they've been putting out so much that they're having to dial back on it. Something we talked about not too long ago on the channel, where they want to focus more on like AAA games and stop putting out like smaller end games that aren't making them a ton of money. Now, we can certainly speak to like the quality of the other games that they're putting out besides like Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest and things like that. That's a different conversation, but they at least have been trying for a while to get new IPs off the ground, and they have had some successful ones like Octopath Traveler and things like that. But also, like, the Dragon Quest games and the Final Fantasy games are still selling well. I think the Dragon Quest games are doing a little bit better than Final Fantasy, but even like 7 Remake, 16, and 7 Rebirth, they're not selling bad. They're not like underperforming in Square Enix's eyes. Or at least they never publicly said that. And like the Dragon Quest games, like Dragon Quest 11, as I mentioned several times throughout this video, sold pretty goddamn well. As long as you're still making money or making some sort of profit off of the new Final Fantasy game, the new Dragon Quest game, why would you stop putting resources into that? That's more or less it for the video, my dudes. That's kind of all the translations that Genki has from this radio show with Sakaguchi and Horii. There was there's just them like saying they're like fans of Ghost of Tsushima. It's not really worth talking about necessarily. I don't know if he's going to do any more translations from this radio show. If he does, we might talk about it if there's something else to talk about. But what are your thoughts? It's kind of a little bit longer of a video. I found myself disagreeing with him, which I didn't know was going to be like the plan going into this video. I just knew I wanted to talk about this shit. I agree with some of the things they were saying, but I found myself disagreeing with like a lot of it. So what are your thoughts? Do you agree with what they were saying in this radio show, or do you disagree? Anyways, that's the video. Subscribe to the channel if you guys are new. Search work in the description below. Follow me on Twitter, @YT. That's it. Bye.
Used to care what people thought, but now I care more, and nobody out here's got it figured out. So therefore, I've lost all hope of a happy ending, depending on whether or not it's worth it. So insecure, no one's perfect. We spend it with no shame. We blow that like Coltrane. We in here like Low Gain, or leave it like Cobain.